"Nobody touches that Ferrari," Richard Hawthorne said, his voice sharp enough to silence an entire 40,000 square foot garage. "Because every person who has tried has only made it worse." The words echoed beneath polished steel beams and skylights where the late afternoon sun spilled across rows of priceless automobiles lined up like museum pieces. Mechanics from Italy stood beside engineers flown in from Germany. Diagnostic tablets glowed. Expensive tools rested neatly on velvet carts. The scent of premium motor oil mixed with fresh wax and cool, conditioned air. Somewhere, an air compressor released a slow hiss before everything became still again. At the center of the room sat the reason for 3 years of frustration. A deep crimson Ferrari unlike any Richard had ever owned. It wasn't the fastest in his collection. It wasn't even the rarest. But it was the only car his late wife, Evelyn, had ever begged him not to sell. She had laughed the day they bought it, running her fingertips across the hood before telling him that machines remembered the people who loved them. Richard had smiled back then. Now the memory only tightened something inside his chest. He had spent more than $12 million trying to restore it exactly as it had been on the last afternoon they drove together along the California coast. Every famous specialist had promised success. Every invoice had arrived with confidence. Every repair ended the same way. The engine refused to come alive. It would crank, hesitate, cough once, then surrender to silence. The Ferrari had become more than an impossible project. It had become the one thing money refused to obey. "Run the diagnostics again," Richard ordered. A senior engineer adjusted his glasses and connected another computer. Streams of data raced across the monitor. Fuel pressure looked perfect. Battery voltage stayed steady. Sensors reported normal readings. Every number insisted the Ferrari should start. Yet when the engineer pressed the ignition button, only one dull click echoed through the garage before another heavy silence settled over the room. No one spoke. No one dared meet Richard's eyes. Across the polished concrete floor, Angela Brooks quietly pushed a cleaning cart between marble support columns. She had worked in the Hawthorne estate for nearly 6 years and had learned that the invisible employees survived the longest. Clean. Smile politely. Never interrupt. Never ask questions. But Noah Brooks, carrying a folded stack of microfiber towels because school had ended early for summer break. Angela had only brought him today because she couldn't leave him home alone while she finished an extra shift. Noah barely noticed the luxury surrounding him. While tourists admired paint finishes and collectors admired price tags, he watched something entirely different. He listened. His eyes lingered on the engine bay each time another mechanic opened the rear cover. His head tilted almost imperceptibly every time someone pressed the ignition. The others heard failure. Noah heard rhythm. He had spent years taking apart broken lawnmowers, discarded generators, old motorcycles, and forgotten pickup engines rescued from junkyards around Charlotte, North Carolina. His late father had always told him, "Every machine has a voice. Most people are too busy talking to hear it." Those words had never left him. Richard turned away from another disappointing report and stared at the Ferrari with exhausted frustration. "Replace everything if you have to," he muttered. "I don't care what it costs anymore." One mechanic nodded nervously. Another reached for a fresh toolbox. Noah looked down at the polished floor, then back toward the Ferrari. Something about the last sound stayed in his mind. It wasn't random. It wasn't complete failure either. It was almost as though the engine wanted to wake up but kept being interrupted by something astonishingly small. He swallowed, unsure whether he should say anything. Angela noticed the look immediately. She gently squeezed his wrist without taking her eyes off the floor. "Just keep helping me," she whispered. "Remember why we're here." Noah nodded, but his attention drifted back toward the crimson Ferrari. Across the garage, another failed attempt filled the room with a hollow click that sounded strangely familiar. His heartbeat quickened. Without realizing it, he took one slow step toward the car. Noah stopped exactly where he was, his sneakers barely making a sound against the polished concrete, but his eyes never left the open engine bay. He had learned years ago that the hardest part about understanding a machine was ignoring the noise created by the people standing around it. Everyone inside the garage seemed determined to prove how much they knew. They debated software updates, imported components, calibration procedures. and factory specifications with the confidence that only expensive education could provide. Noah listened instead to the spaces between their words, where the unanswered questions always lived. Angela noticed him staring again and quietly rolled her cleaning cart beside him. "Please, do not even think about it," she whispered, keeping her smile polite as another employee walked past. "We are here to clean, finish our shift, and go home." Noah nodded immediately because disappointing his mother had never been an option. She had sacrificed too much for him. Every morning she woke before sunrise, caught 2 buses across Charlotte, worked long hours in houses she could never afford, and still found enough energy every evening to ask about his homework, his science projects, and every strange invention scattered across their tiny apartment. She never complained about sore feet or aching hands, although Noah noticed both. She simply smiled and reminded him that education could open doors. No amount of money ever could. Their apartment sat above an aging laundromat, where the pipes rattled every winter and the windows trembled whenever delivery trucks rolled past. It was small, barely 700 square feet, but inside one corner of Noah's bedroom stood something far more valuable than expensive furniture. An old wooden workbench, built by his father years before illness, had taken him away. The surface was scarred with burn marks, scratches, pencil measurements, and faded oil stains. Boxes underneath held discarded alternators, cracked carburetors, broken circuit boards, loose wiring harnesses, rusted bearings, and dozens of engine parts most people considered worthless. Noah saw possibilities instead of junk. He spent weekends taking everything apart, studying each piece until he understood not only what it did but why someone had designed it that way. When something failed, he refused to replace it until he understood the reason. His father had insisted that true mechanics never chased symptoms. They found causes. That lesson stayed with Noah long after the garage where his father worked had closed forever. During high school, while classmates played video games or scrolled through their phones after class, Noah watched engineering lectures from universities, downloaded repair manuals for vehicles he would probably never own, and borrowed physics books from the public library. Sometimes librarians smiled when they saw another stack of automotive engineering textbooks balanced in his arms. Sometimes they looked surprised that a teenager wanted books instead of entertainment. Noah never minded either reaction. Learning felt peaceful. Machines made sense in ways people often did not. Across the garage, another specialist stepped away from the Ferrari, shaking his head with visible frustration. "Everything checks out," he said. "There is no logical explanation." Richard folded his arms tightly without answering. The sentence had become painfully familiar over the past 3 years. Noah quietly looked toward the rear of the car again. Something about the wiring near the ignition assembly seemed strangely untouched compared to the freshly polished components surrounding it. Every replacement part gleamed beneath the bright overhead lights except one small section hidden deeper inside the engine compartment. It almost looked forgotten. He narrowed his eyes, replaying the sound of the failed ignition in his memory again and again. His breathing slowed. His father had once shown him an old pickup truck that everyone believed needed a new engine. After listening for less than a minute, he had discovered a loose ground connection worth less than $5. "Never let expensive repairs distract you from simple truths," his father had said while tightening a single bolt. "Electricity does not care how rich the owner is." Noah felt those words echo through his thoughts now. Before he realized what he was doing, his feet carried him another careful step closer to the Ferrari, curiosity quietly overcoming caution, while the room remained completely unaware that the smallest observer had just noticed something everyone else had overlooked. Another step brought Noah close enough to see the reflection of the ceiling lights dancing across the crimson paint. He stopped immediately when one of the senior mechanics noticed him standing near the vehicle. The man looked down at Noah's faded sneakers, then at the folded microfiber towel still hanging from his hand. "Employees and families stay behind the yellow line," he said without raising his voice, but the message carried enough weight for several others to glance over. Noah immediately stepped back. "I am sorry, sir," he answered respectfully. "I was only looking." The mechanic gave a quick nod before returning to the engine, clearly convinced the conversation was over. Richard Hawthorne remained beside the driver's door, studying another inspection report with growing disappointment. Every page looked almost identical to the last dozen reports scattered across the carbon fiber workbench. Perfect compression, perfect fuel delivery, perfect electronic diagnostics. Every expensive measurement claimed success, while the silent engine insisted otherwise. Richard slowly removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The exhaustion on his face was no longer hidden behind tailored suits or polished confidence. 3 years earlier, he had been known throughout the automotive world as the billionaire collector whose private garage contained some of the rarest machines ever built. Magazine photographers competed for invitations to photograph his collection. Television hosts called him the man who could buy anything. Those headlines no longer mattered. None of them had managed to give him back the one memory that refused to start. He glanced toward a framed photograph resting alone on a walnut shelf overlooking the garage. Evelyn smiled from behind the steering wheel, sunlight catching the loose strands of her chestnut hair, while the same Ferrari rested beside an empty stretch of Pacific Coast Highway. That photograph had been taken only weeks before illness quietly entered their lives. She had insisted on driving that morning because she always claimed the car sounded happier when someone smiled behind the wheel. Richard had laughed then. Now he found himself replaying that sentence almost every night. A younger engineer cautiously approached him holding another electronic scanner. "Sir, we could replace the complete wiring harness again. It would eliminate any remaining possibility." Richard looked at him for several long seconds before speaking. "That will be the 4th complete replacement." "Yes, sir." "And the 3rd ignition module?" "Yes, sir." "And the 2nd engine control unit?" "Yes, sir." Richard quietly folded the report. "Then tell me why every new part keeps producing the exact same silence." The young engineer lowered his eyes, unable to answer. Around the garage, conversations faded once again. No one wanted to admit that the world's finest technicians had reached the edge of their knowledge. Angela continued dusting the display shelves without lifting her head, hoping Noah would simply remain invisible until their shift ended. She knew how quickly wealthy employers could mistake curiosity for disrespect. Noah respected that fear because he had watched his mother carry it every working day of his life. Yet something inside him refused to let go of the unanswered question waiting beneath the Ferrari's rear cover. He was no longer looking at polished metal or expensive engineering. He was looking at a puzzle. His father used to scatter broken components across the workbench and tell him that every mystery already contained its own solution if he learned to ask the right questions. Noah quietly replayed every sound he had heard during the repeated starting attempts. One click, half a heartbeat of resistance, then absolute silence. It was too consistent to be random. Machines rarely repeated mistakes with such perfect timing unless something fundamental had been misunderstood. His eyes drifted toward the narrow section of wiring hidden beneath a protective bracket. The insulation looked older than every surrounding component. Tiny traces of dust rested in places no recent repair should have left untouched. Someone had rebuilt nearly everything around one forgotten connection. Noah felt his pulse quicken. Without thinking, he whispered almost to himself, "They never checked the original ground path." The words were barely louder than a breath, yet in the stillness of the garage they carried farther than he expected. One nearby technician slowly turned his head. Another paused with a wrench still in his hand. Richard lifted his eyes from Evelyn's photograph and looked directly toward the quiet 16-year-old standing beside a cleaning cart. Richard studied Noah for several silent seconds, not with curiosity but with the weary skepticism of a man who had already listened to hundreds of opinions that led nowhere. Around him, the mechanics exchanged uncertain glances before one of them let out a restrained laugh. "Did you say something?" the senior engineer asked. Noah swallowed, suddenly aware that every eye in the garage had shifted toward him. "Yes, sir," he answered carefully. "I only meant that the original ground path may not have been inspected after all the replacement parts were installed." A brief silence followed before another technician smiled politely, almost amused. "Son, this vehicle has been examined by Ferrari factory engineers, electrical specialists, and restoration experts from 3 countries. I promise you, every ground connection has already been checked." Noah nodded respectfully. "I understand, sir. I am only saying that I do not think they checked the original one after everything else changed around it." Richard slowly folded the inspection report in his hands. "How old are you?" he asked. 16, sir." And where exactly did you study Ferrari engineering? Noah hesitated before answering honestly. I did not, sir. I study mechanical systems at home, mostly older engines, electrical circuits, and repair manuals. A few mechanics quietly chuckled. One shook his head while organizing expensive diagnostic equipment. Another whispered something under his breath that made two others smile. Angela felt her stomach tighten. She immediately stepped forward, placing herself slightly between Noah and the gathering crowd. Mr. Hawthorne, I sincerely apologize, she said softly. He meant no disrespect. He has always loved fixing machines. Sometimes he becomes excited when he sees an engine. Richard looked toward Angela rather than Noah. His expression remained calm, but there was a distance in his eyes that years of privilege had quietly built. Your son is curious, he replied. That is not a problem. But curiosity and expertise are very different things. Angela lowered her head. Yes, sir. Noah felt the disappointment in his mother's voice more sharply than any laughter surrounding him. He wished he had stayed silent, yet the image of that untouched connection refused to leave his mind. He took a slow breath. Sir, he said carefully, making sure every word carried respect. I know I have no credentials. I know everyone here has far more experience than I do. But if I am wrong, then nothing changes. If I am right, it only takes a few seconds to check. The room became still once again. Richard looked directly into Noah's eyes, searching for arrogance, but finding only quiet conviction. Before he could answer, the senior engineer stepped forward. Mr. Hawthorne, with respect, we cannot allow untrained people near a vehicle worth several $1,000,000. Insurance alone would never permit it. Another specialist immediately agreed. If word spread that we let a teenager handle this restoration, every professional involved would become a laughingstock. Several heads nodded. Richard listened without interrupting. His attention drifted briefly toward the Ferrari, then back toward Noah. You seem confident, he said. Noah shook his head. No, sir. Just curious. Curiosity can become expensive. Yes, sir. Richard walked a few slow steps until he stood beside the rear of the Ferrari. The polished body reflected both men standing several feet apart, separated by far more than distance. Do you know how much money has been invested trying to solve this problem? Richard asked quietly. No, sir. More than most people earn in several lifetimes. Noah remained silent. Richard continued. Dozens of experts have failed. Engineers who have spent their entire careers working on cars like this one. I believe that, sir. Then why should I believe a 16-year-old standing beside a cleaning cart? Noah looked down for a brief moment before answering. You should not believe me because of who I am. You should only believe what the engine is trying to tell us. The words lingered in the quiet air. Even the mechanics who had been smiling moments earlier stopped moving. Angela gently reached for Noah's arm, hoping the conversation would end before it became something neither of them could repair. Richard remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the young man whose confidence came without pride. Then the senior engineer stepped between them and spoke firmly. Mr. Hawthorne, we have another replacement module arriving within the hour. I strongly recommend we continue with the original plan. Richard looked from the engineer to Noah one final time before giving a slow nod. Very well, he said. The professionals will continue. Noah quietly stepped backward without protest. But as he turned toward his mother's cleaning cart, his eyes lingered on the hidden corner beneath the engine bay, where that forgotten connection waited, almost as though it had been silently waiting for someone willing to notice it. The replacement module arrived 40 minutes later inside a padded aluminum case that looked more like medical equipment than an automotive component. Two technicians handled it with careful precision while another updated the diagnostic software one more time. Richard stood silently beside the Ferrari, his expression unreadable, watching another expensive solution prepare to meet the same unanswered question. Noah and Angela had quietly returned to cleaning the far side of the garage. Neither of them spoke. Angela worked with practiced efficiency, wiping fingerprints from display cabinets filled with trophies and racing memorabilia, but her thoughts stayed on the conversation that had unfolded only minutes earlier. She worried that Noah's curiosity had crossed a line that people in positions like theirs could not afford to cross. Promise me something, she said softly without looking up. What is it, Mom? Do not let pride become heavier than kindness. Sometimes being right is not worth hurting someone. Noah gently folded another microfiber cloth. I know, Mom. I was not trying to prove anyone wrong. She finally looked at him and smiled, though concern still lingered behind her eyes. I believe you. Across the garage, another attempt began. The lead engineer connected the final cables and nodded toward Richard. Everything is ready, sir. Richard gave a quiet signal. The ignition button was pressed. Once again, the starter engaged. Once again, the engine hesitated for the briefest instant. Once again, only silence answered. Nobody moved. One mechanic slowly removed his headset. Another closed the laptop without saying a word. Even the hum of the climate control system suddenly seemed louder than before. Richard lowered his head and exhaled slowly. Enough, he said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable disappointment. Everyone take a break. The specialists dispersed quietly across the garage, gathering coffee, reviewing notes, or making phone calls they already knew would solve nothing. Noah watched from across the room. His eyes drifted instinctively toward the same narrow section beneath the engine compartment. He could almost trace the invisible path electricity should have taken. The untouched connector continued to bother him like an unfinished sentence. A pair of technicians standing nearby noticed him looking again. One leaned toward the other with a faint smile. He is still studying it. The second shrugged. Kids watch a few repair videos online and suddenly think they can outsmart factory engineers. They laughed quietly, not cruelly enough to cause a scene, but loudly enough for Noah to hear every word. He lowered his eyes and returned to folding cleaning towels. Angela heard the conversation too. She placed a gentle hand on her son's shoulder without saying anything. She knew silence sometimes protected dignity better than arguments ever could. Richard remained alone beside the Ferrari after everyone else drifted away. His gaze settled once more on Evelyn's photograph resting across the garage. The smile in the picture felt impossibly alive against the stillness surrounding him. He remembered the afternoon she insisted that restoring old things required patience rather than force. She had never spoken only about cars. She believed the same about people. Richard slowly reached into his jacket pocket and removed her wedding ring, which he still carried every day inside a small velvet pouch. He held it quietly in his palm while the sunlight shifted across the polished floor. For a brief moment, the garage no longer felt like a showroom. It felt like a place where memories had become trapped inside silent machinery. Noah happened to glance in Richard's direction and immediately looked away again. He had never seen Grief wear such expensive clothes before, but he recognized it all the same. It looked exactly like the expression his own father used to wear during the months before he passed away, smiling for everyone else while carrying invisible weight alone. Noah no longer wanted to fix the Ferrari simply because it fascinated him. He wanted to restore something that clearly meant far more than metal and horsepower. As Angela packed the last of her cleaning supplies onto the cart, Noah quietly looked toward the untouched engine one final time. He whispered so softly that only he could hear the words, "You are trying to start. Something is keeping you from coming home." Almost at that same moment, a faint metallic reflection caught Richard's eye beneath the rear compartment. It came from the exact place Noah had been watching all afternoon, and for the first time that day, Richard found himself wondering why the boy had kept looking at the same hidden corner while every certified expert had focused everywhere else. The afternoon slowly surrendered to evening as golden sunlight stretched through the towering glass walls of the garage, turning polished chrome into ribbons of amber light. One by one, the specialists gathered their equipment without the confidence they had carried only hours earlier. Expensive laptops disappeared into protective cases. Diagnostic cables were coiled with quiet resignation. Toolboxes closed with soft metallic clicks that echoed longer than usual inside the enormous building. No one celebrated another day of work because nothing had changed. The Ferrari remained silent, just as it had yesterday and the day before. Outside, dark clouds drifted across the Carolina sky, and a gentle summer rain began tapping against the skylights overhead. The sound spread across the garage in a steady rhythm, almost like quiet fingers drumming on glass. Richard Hawthorne remained standing alone beside the motionless car, while everyone else slowly found reasons to busy themselves elsewhere. He rested one hand lightly against the smooth roof, closed his eyes, and listened to the rain. For a brief moment he could almost imagine another afternoon years ago when Evelyn had laughed as unexpected rain forced them to pull the Ferrari beneath an old gas station awning somewhere outside Monterey. She had looked at him with the same easy smile she seemed to carry through every season of life and said, "People always think speed is what makes a car unforgettable. It is never the speed. It is who is sitting beside you." Richard opened his eyes again. The empty passenger seat reflected faintly through the windshield, untouched for 3 years. He quietly slipped the velvet pouch containing Evelyn's wedding ring back into his pocket and whispered words no one else was close enough to hear. "I have tried everything." The sentence disappeared beneath the gentle rain before anyone could answer. Across the garage, Angela finished wiping the final glass display case and carefully placed the cleaning cloth inside her cart. "We should leave," she said softly. Noah nodded, but before reaching for the cart, he looked one last time toward the Ferrari. The hidden section beneath the engine compartment remained almost invisible beneath layers of polished components, yet his instincts refused to release it. Machines had patterns. So did mistakes. His father used to say that every unanswered problem left tiny footprints if someone cared enough to slow down and notice them. Noah remembered being 9 years old, sitting beside his father on overturned milk crates inside a neighborhood repair shop after closing time. An old pickup truck had refused to start despite receiving a brand new battery, alternator, and starter motor. Every customer believed the engine itself had failed. His father simply sat quietly for nearly 10 minutes, listening without touching a single wrench. Finally, he smiled, tightened one forgotten cable hidden beneath years of grease, and the truck started immediately. Noah had laughed in amazement. His father only smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "The loudest opinions usually hide the smallest truths," he had said. Standing inside Richard's garage now, Noah could almost hear those words as clearly as the rain falling overhead. He wondered whether that same forgotten lesson had somehow followed him all the way to this impossible Ferrari. He did not feel smarter than the engineers surrounding it. He only felt unwilling to ignore the quiet detail everyone else seemed too busy to notice. Richard slowly walked toward the wide windows overlooking the estate grounds. Rain blurred the gardens into soft shades of green, while tiny streams rolled across the stone driveway below. The mansion behind him remained as grand as ever, yet it had never felt emptier. Wealth filled every room except the one place he wanted it most. He glanced back toward the Ferrari once again. Then, almost without realizing why, his eyes followed the exact direction Noah had been studying throughout the afternoon. The reflection beneath the engine shifted as another flash of sunlight slipped through the clouds between passing showers. Something small glimmered for less than a second before disappearing again. Richard frowned. It was not large enough to catch anyone's attention under ordinary circumstances. Today, nothing about this day felt ordinary anymore. Across the room, Noah gently picked up the handle of his mother's cleaning cart and began walking toward the service exit. Just before reaching the door, he turned back one final time. Richard happened to be looking directly at him. Neither of them spoke. No accusation, no challenge. Only a long, thoughtful silence stretched between two people from completely different worlds, connected by the same unanswered mystery waiting beneath a quiet crimson machine. Richard broke the silence first. "Angela." His voice was calm, almost hesitant, carrying none of the sharp certainty it had held earlier that afternoon. Angela stopped beside the service door and turned immediately. "Yes, sir?" Richard glanced toward Noah before looking back at the Ferrari. "Would your son be willing to answer one question?" Angela looked at Noah with quiet uncertainty. Noah nodded gently. They walked back across the polished floor, while several mechanics looked up from packing their equipment. One by one, conversations faded. Richard stopped beside the open engine compartment. "You spent the entire afternoon looking at the same place," he said. "Why?" Noah did not answer immediately. He stepped close enough to see inside the engine bay without touching anything. "Because everything around that section is new," he replied softly. "Everything except one connection." The lead engineer folded his arms. "That connection has already been inspected." Noah respectfully shook his head. "I believe the connection itself has. I am not sure the path underneath it has." The engineer frowned. "Explain." Noah pointed without crossing the invisible line surrounding the car. When the replacement harness was installed, the the mounting bracket changed position. If the original ground strap underneath twisted even a few degrees before tightening, it could create resistance only when the starter draws full current. Every computer would still report normal voltage because they test without the same load. Several mechanics exchanged puzzled glances. One quietly reopened his laptop. Another scrolled through previous diagnostic reports. Richard looked toward the lead engineer. Could that happen? The engineer hesitated. In theory, yes, but it would be extremely unlikely. Noah nodded. I agree, sir. Extremely unlikely. But the engine sounds like it wants to start. It does not sound dead. It sounds interrupted. The room became completely still. Richard slowly stepped aside. Show me what you are seeing. Angela instinctively reached toward Noah's arm. Noah, she whispered, fear and hope mixing in the same breath. Noah smiled gently. It is all right, Mom. Richard noticed the hesitation in Angela's face. He will not be asked to repair anything, he said quietly. Only to point. Angela gave a small nod. Noah approached the Ferrari carefully, moving with the respect of someone entering a place that carried another person's memories. He leaned slightly over the rear compartment, keeping his hands behind his back at first. May I touch the bracket, sir? Richard answered without taking his eyes off him. Go ahead. Noah reached in slowly. His fingertips rested lightly against a narrow metal support, hidden beneath layers of polished components. He gently moved a flashlight lying nearby so the beam reached deeper into the engine bay. The reflected light revealed a thin, braided ground strap tucked beneath the bracket. Noah smiled almost immediately. There, he whispered. The lead engineer leaned closer. What are we looking at? Noah pointed carefully. The strap is trapped beneath the edge of the bracket, instead of lying flat against the mounting surface. The bolt is tight, but only part of the metal is making contact. One mechanic crouched beside him, shining a second light into the same space. His expression changed almost instantly. Wait, he murmured. He is right. Another engineer joined him. How did we miss that? The first mechanic loosened the mounting bolt by less than half a turn. The braided strap slipped naturally into its proper position, with almost no effort at all. He tightened the bolt again, checked the connection twice, then slowly stood. Nobody spoke. Richard looked toward the engineer. That is all? The man swallowed. If the resistance was there, yes, sir. Richard looked toward Noah. Would you do the honor? Noah blinked in surprise. Me, sir? Richard stepped aside from the driver's door. You noticed what all of us overlooked. I think you have earned the right. Noah carefully climbed into the driver's seat, his hands almost trembling. The leather carried the faint scent of cedar and old craftsmanship. He rested one hand on the steering wheel exactly as Evelyn smiled in the photograph. Then he looked toward Richard for permission. Richard gave one slow nod. Noah pressed the ignition button. For one heartbeat, the garage held its breath. Then the engine awakened with a deep, rich growl that rolled through the building like distant thunder before settling into a smooth, confident idle. Every polished window trembled softly with the sound. Rain continued falling outside, but inside the garage no one moved. Dozens of experienced professionals stood frozen as the Ferrari, silent for 3 long years, finally came back to life. The deep rumble settled into a perfectly balanced idle, filling the garage with a sound no one had heard in 3 years. It was smooth, confident, almost alive, as though the machine had simply been waiting for someone willing to listen instead of forcing another expensive solution upon it. Noah slowly removed his hand from the ignition button and looked toward Richard without saying a word. He did not smile with triumph. He simply stepped back from the driver's seat, leaving the Ferrari exactly as he had found it, except now it breathed again. Around the garage, the silence lingered for several long seconds before the lead engineer quietly closed his eyes and exhaled. We all missed it, he admitted. Another technician slowly shook his head in disbelief. We replaced nearly every major component and never questioned the simplest connection. One by one, the specialists lowered their eyes. There was no embarrassment in their expressions anymore, only humility. Richard remained motionless beside the open driver's door. His gaze rested on the steering wheel where Noah's hands had been only moments earlier, then drifted toward the framed photograph of Evelyn smiling beside the same car. Something softened across his face. The lines that years of grief had carved into his expression seemed lighter somehow. He walked slowly toward Noah until only a few feet separated them. Angela instinctively stepped closer to her son, uncertain what would come next. Richard looked first at Angela, then back at Noah. "I owe both of you an apology," he said quietly. The words surprised everyone in the room because they carried no hesitation. "This afternoon I looked at your uniforms before I listened to your words. I allowed assumptions to speak louder than truth." Angela lowered her eyes. "Sir, there is no need." Richard gently shook his head. "There is every need." He turned toward the assembled engineers. "All day I believed expertise belonged only to titles, degrees, and reputations. I forgot that wisdom often arrives wearing ordinary clothes." Nobody argued. The lead engineer stepped forward and extended his hand toward Noah. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "You reminded me why I became an engineer in the first place. We are supposed to solve problems, not defend our pride." Noah accepted the handshake respectfully. "I learned from people who never stopped asking questions, sir." Richard smiled faintly. "Your father?" Noah nodded. "Yes, sir. He repaired almost anything. He always said machines reward patience." Richard looked toward the Ferrari once more. He was right. Rain continued falling softly beyond the skylights, but the atmosphere inside the garage had completely changed. The room no longer felt divided by job titles or expensive suits. It felt united by quiet respect. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and removed the small velvet pouch once again. He opened it carefully and looked at Evelyn's wedding ring resting in his palm. "She believed people deserved to be seen for who they were," he said, almost speaking to himself. "I spent years remembering her words without truly living by them." He gently closed his hand around the ring before looking back at Noah. "You gave me back more than a car today." Noah looked genuinely puzzled. "I only noticed a connection, sir." Richard smiled with emotion warming his voice. "Exactly. You noticed the one connection everyone else overlooked. Not only inside the engine." Angela quietly wiped away a tear before anyone noticed. She had spent years entering grand homes through service entrances, quietly doing work that allowed other people to shine while remaining invisible herself. For the first time in a very long while, someone with extraordinary wealth had looked directly at her son and recognized his character before his circumstances. Richard walked toward a nearby cabinet, removed a leather portfolio, and returned. He handed it to Noah. "Inside is a full scholarship to the Hawthorne Engineering Foundation. It covers your education, books, research, internships, and every opportunity we can provide." Noah stared at the folder without reaching for it. "Sir, I cannot repay something like this." Richard gently placed the portfolio into his hands. "You already have. You reminded me that talent does not ask permission before it appears. It simply waits for someone willing to recognize it." Noah looked at his mother before answering. Angela gave him a quiet nod filled with pride. Noah finally accepted the portfolio with both hands. "Thank you, sir. I promise I will never stop learning." Richard extended his hand once more, not to a cleaning woman's son, but to a young engineer whose future had just begun. This time, when Noah shook it, there was no distance left between them. Several weeks passed, and the sound that once echoed only inside Richard Hawthorne's private garage began changing lives far beyond its polished walls. Every Saturday morning, before the rest of the estate awakened, the crimson Ferrari rolled slowly onto the circular driveway beneath rows of old oak trees. Richard no longer drove it alone. Noah usually sat in the passenger seat, holding a notebook instead of a phone, asking questions about engineering, business, and the responsibility that came with success. Richard answered each one honestly, sometimes admitting he did not know the answer himself. Those conversations became more valuable than any lecture either of them could have attended. Inside the garage, one small change quietly transformed everything else. The yellow line that once separated executives from service staff disappeared. Richard ordered it removed without ceremony. "Good ideas do not stop at painted lines," he told his employees during the next staff meeting. "Neither should respect." Some people smiled, others simply nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Angela noticed the difference almost immediately. Employees who had once hurried past her without a greeting now stopped to ask about her day. Mechanics invited her to share coffee during breaks, instead of assuming she belonged somewhere else. Nothing about her uniform changed, yet somehow people finally looked beyond it. She carried herself exactly as she always had, with quiet dignity and kindness. But now kindness was being returned. Noah began attending engineering workshops sponsored by the Hawthorne Foundation, where professors quickly discovered what Richard had already seen. Noah did not memorize answers better than everyone else. He asked better questions. Whenever classmates rushed toward complicated solutions, he searched patiently for simple truths hiding underneath. His instructors often noticed that he spent more time listening than speaking. It reminded Richard of someone else. One autumn afternoon, months after the Ferrari came back to life, Richard invited Noah into his office overlooking the garage. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, reflecting softly across shelves filled with automotive history and family photographs. The framed picture of Evelyn still occupied its place of honor, but now another photograph rested beside it. It showed Angela and Noah standing together in front of the Ferrari on the evening everything had changed. Richard noticed Noah looking at the picture and smiled. "Your mother asked why I wanted that photograph in here," he said quietly. Noah looked up. "What did you tell her?" Richard walked toward the frame and gently brushed a speck of dust from the glass. "I told her it reminds me that the most important lessons never arrive when we expect them." Noah smiled softly. "My father used to say something similar." Richard nodded. "I think I would have liked meeting him." Outside the office windows, the garage buzzed with steady activity. Engineers worked beside apprentices. Experienced mechanics listened carefully when interns offered fresh ideas. Titles still existed, but pride no longer spoke first. Richard had changed one company policy after another, creating scholarship programs for students whose talent had been overlooked because opportunity never found them. Every application was reviewed without photographs attached, because he wanted names and backgrounds to become less important than character and ability. When reporters later asked what inspired those changes, Richard never mentioned the cost of the Ferrari or the years of failed repairs. He simply answered, "The greatest mistake I ever made was believing I already knew where wisdom belonged." One cool evening, as the sun settled beyond the trees surrounding the estate, Noah and Angela prepared to leave after visiting the garage. The Ferrari rested quietly beneath warm overhead lights, its engine now silent by choice rather than failure. Richard stood near the entrance, watching them walk toward the parking lot. Angela thanked him one final time before getting into her modest sedan. Richard gently shook his head. "No," he replied with a peaceful smile. "Thank you for bringing your son to work that day." Noah opened the passenger door, then paused. He looked back toward the garage one last time. The polished floor reflected the fading orange light of sunset, and somewhere inside, the Ferrari's cooling engine released one final soft tick as warm metal settled into stillness. Noah smiled, remembering his father's words that machines remembered the people who cared enough to understand them. Perhaps people were not so different after all. Richard remained standing where he was until the small sedan disappeared beyond the front gates. He slipped Evelyn's wedding ring gently into his pocket, looked toward the quiet Ferrari, and realized that the engine had not been the only thing restored. Some victories arrived without applause. Some miracles sounded like nothing more than an engine finally breathing again. And in the peaceful silence that followed, the distance between wealth and humility, between grief and hope, between strangers and family, seemed smaller than it had ever been before.